Welcome to the Will to Power podcast. I am your host, Nick Vital. I'm broadcasting deep from the jungle in a tropical region, hoping to avoid World War III. In this episode, I'm going to be discussing the key problems of utopian liberal communism. And I want to address this to a broad swath of audience, right? I want to be able to talk to people on the right and the left because I feel like I'm in the center. Not in the sense that this kind of cringy, like middle path, oh, let's all get along center, but rather I want to shit talk you from all sides. So let's get into it. Now, if you were to ask a person on the far left what their vision of society is, if you were to ask an actual communist, somebody who is unironically a communist, what their vision of society is, they would say something like, well, it's communism. It's a classless, stateless society. Well, and what that means is that because the currently existing kind of social strata based on capitalism in which workers produce goods, capitalists own the capital and profit from that. Once you do away with that and do away with other forms of oppression, you won't need a class state, one which enforces the rule of a ruling class. So that is their ultimate desire, is this kind of utopic society without all of that, right? It's very vague and more to the point. It's based on like this kind of stacking up hypothetical best outcome scenarios, right? So, well, if we do this and we do that, and if it all works out and we do this, and then we, figure this problem and we do that, and this is this just kind of escalating best case outcomes based on a lot of kind of assumptions, and you get this kind of vision of society in which everything's more or less perfect yet extremely different than today. Somehow everything is worked out though, and it's this sort of paradise. And that's more or less it. And I know that sounds kind of belittling if you are on the left, but that's the kind of short end of the stick of it. Now, the problem with that though, and I'm going to get into a number of issues. I'll get into a number of issues which kind of undermine a lot of that, and I'll try to piece together an alternative, because I just don't want to shit on this kind of utopic vision of communism without providing a kind of alternative, which is simply based on historical materialism. And I think that's the kind of point that I would like to make to utopian communists who might be listening to this, is that a perfect kind of classless, stateless society is not necessarily the logical outcome of historical materialism, but there is a sort of least shit option. And I'll get into that a little bit later. And there is a best case option, and I want to talk about that too. But let's get in. So the first reason that utopic communism kind of falls flat every time it's tried, and it kind of devolves back into liberalizes their economy or collapses and whatnot. It eventually liberalizes their economy. Is that desires are unlimited and status is finite. And what that means is that what people want and what they feel they need, it's very conditional. And it can kind of reach unlimited proportions, especially when it comes to things like addiction. So, and we have to remember that a lot of kind of wants and desires are manufactured. So it's a very kind of malleable kind of understanding of human nature, but also in the terms of status. Status is a finite resource. So first of all, you can't necessarily produce enough for humans to all feel satisfied with their desires, because their desires can always be raised. Expectations can always raise higher. But status itself is finite, right? There's only so much status to go around. There has to be kind of higher status for there to be lower status, and vice versa, right? You don't get high status without there being something to compare it to. And humans are naturally driven by the fact that they're biological creatures that have had to evolve over millions of years to compete for status. But again, that's also pretty malleable too, right? Status can be based off all sorts of things, and you can really have unfortunate consequences when you start to base status on destructive things or on things that are decadent and ruinous to your own society. And that's a big problem in the West right there, is you have status based on bling and fucking material objects chasing this kind of photoshopped Instagram version of reality. When, again, those desires can't ever be met, and that status is finite. So it turns people into a loop if it's not minded. And obviously within the current system, it is minded in private, right? Like, marketing agencies consciously use these sorts of notions to sell more shit. And, this kind of happens under socialism too, right? But you can modify that, right? What is the desire of a North Korean person? It's honestly not much. Like, they probably get along fine, buying fresh vegetables every fucking day, living living in a an actual traditional family compared to the West, cooking that shit, getting along. They don't need a lot. And in all honesty, they might be a lot happier with that. But again, even in that society, status is finite, right? There's only so many people at the top. There's definitely people that have economic privileges over others based on their relationship to whatever sort of hierarchy they have going on there. So there's that issue. But going one step further, there's the kind of utopic. If you ask somebody what communism kind of means from a Marxist lens, they'll say from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. Now, again, these are very conditional things. Not all people are equal in their abilities. Abilities themselves can be trained over time. Speaking of which, I will be right back after this short break. The significance of this notion of from each according to their ability to each according to their needs is that it raises the obvious question of who decides what our needs, who decides what our abilities, and who conditions these things. Like I already discussed, like with desires, needs themselves are very malleable, right? People's what they feel they are entitled to adjusts over time, and this is not necessarily a bad thing. But again, it raises the question of like these needs can be depressed, and that might not be a bad thing, right? A little bit of austerity is a good thing sometimes, but from each according to their abilities as well. I mean, there's this old kind of saying in the Soviet Union, Cuba, maybe it's apocryphal to some extent, but we pretend to work, they pretend to pay us, right? Very little labor productivity, a very low labor morale, because there is this tension that's naturally going to arise between those who hold an elite position within the political economic structure of even these socialist states that arises. And that brings me into the next point. And this is leading into a little bit of a history lesson as well. Before we go into the big history lesson, I think it's important to note that when you kind of mention that, the kind of leftists will resort to, well, that wasn't real socialism, right? Real socialism and real communism is workers owning and controlling the means of production. And this is a very big platitude. What does that mean, right? Now, there is a difference between owning and controlling. That's another huge point. You can have collective ownership of something, but if it's controlled by a small group within that, which is naturally going to case, the 80-20 principle is going to prevail. But let's hope it prevails in a way that benefits society and not, decays it. So you get this kind of situation where there's no real way for the entirety of the working class to own and control effectively the means of production. And they'll say, well, you know how democracy works. You vote for people, and in this case, not only do they represent you politically, as in so-called liberal democracy, it's also an entire social leadership as well as the people who are supposed to appoint other people to centrally plan the economy. Now, imagine that this isn't going to work out very well. Problems will ensue. And this brings me to the big history lesson. What generally happens is that these societies are non-competitive with kind of more dynamic capitalist societies. That's not to say the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China weren't useful formations, right? They lifted societies out of war, essentially, into becoming powerful countries. So it worked out in the end, just not in the way that the kind of leftists would hope so, right? You had the Soviet Union eventually collapse, after they did their market reforms, and now you got what's going on in Russia, right? It's all kind of big mobs running everything. It's the West, it's China, it's Russia. They're kind of mafias, right? Either way. In any case, so what you kind of get is that you have a non-competitive society in which there is that low morale. Other countries, other societies simply outproduce you. They produce more shit with less capital inputs. And it's a very simple market equation that you're not going to do well in that situation, right? You're going to be at a disadvantage in the market if you choose to engage it at an international level, and other countries are going to be more inclined to deal with people who can trade with them for less, or you're going to get less profit from it. So you have that issue, right? You have the West kind of made better shit with less capital inputs, with a little bit more innovation. Just had more kind of, you had a kind of economy in the West. You had 15 brands of fucking dish detergent. You had one, it was powdered probably in the Soviet Union. And, there's kind of that. And now obviously it's better, right? Like you go to China, they have liquid detergent. But sure, they have multiple brands too. But the case being is these centrally planned economies simply weren't competitive, right? They eventually had to give way to liberalization. They did a great job of lifting these societies out of war, right? Out of colonization. It wasn't terrible. But, it took them kind of embracing that liberalization after kind of new bourgeoisie had seized elite control over the means of production, and they kind of, transitioned themselves. So it's been a kind of recurring problem, right? And the other kind of excuse that more tankies will come up with they'll say, well, the U.S. and the West was always interfering, right? As soon as the Soviet Union formed, the West ganged together and tried to invade them in 1919. And it's okay, cope. You're playing a competitive sport here, right? It's revolutionary warfare. You can't blame the opposite team for playing offense. Right? It's like playing soccer and be like, oh my God, the other team scored on us. It's their fault we lost. I mean, it's just, there's that. And it cuts to a more real, less abstract, less analogous situation in which it will always be the twin allure in these kind of centrally planned economies in places like Cuba today, to some extent, where you have material enticements from the West combined with foreign interference. And how do you overcome that? It's a very intractable problem, quite honestly. So let's continue. They liberalized their economy, and you kind of had a situation where it never was really the democratic control of the means of production, right? That's a giant cope. At best, you had a kind of a progressive ruling elite, whether you want to call it a class, whether you want to call it a caste, a political caste, who, for better or worse, kind of shape society in their, I don't want to say image, but in their image of the world. And that's what people do, right? It's very natural. Hopefully it's a good image. So that leads us to is there an inevitable thing? Is this kind of technocratic elite an inevitable development in this stage of the development of the means of production? And that's what I mean by right-wing, or I guess heterodox, let's call it heterodox historical materialism. is, we have a kind of base of the level of the means of production, right? It's where it's at. And what kind of societies can we get from that? Is it this sort of technocratic elite, whether it's liberal democracy or whether it's, the one party, the uniparty state, where you don't spend billions of dollars on sham elections? So that brings me to and I say this non-facetiously, right? There's a lot of pros that go with these societies, right? These attempts of kind of Marxist societies, even though they liberalize their economies, they're not, they're not this en route to the communist paradise anymore. They don't necessarily see themselves like that. And if they do, it's kind of like a justifying ideology. But it's not for the worst, right? Like, these societies aren't terrible compared to the West. Look where the West is now. Look where China's at now. Obviously they have their problems. They got the materialism, they have the demographic crunch, but let's be real. Like, it's not like the last 30 years hasn't happened. And so, but we get this situation, and let's take this further. How will the leftists respond, right? If you talk to the Maoist, right, the person who's really deep into like the fringes of the left, and they'll say this unironically. They'll be like, well, we need great proletarian culture revolutions, right? We need once this kind of new bourgeoisie arises within the socialist state, well, we just got to have more revolutions. And this is like, okay, and it kind of begs the question: are we just perpetually going to have periodic episodes of violence, intercene, intercultural, civilizational violence against ourselves? Is that really until it works, until we get the communism? So it's an interesting perspective. I'll leave it at that. But it's storybook level in a way. It's interesting, right? Like, utopias always are. So there's another big point that utopic communists kind of miss, and this goes through the broader left as well. They often want to develop societies that are based on promoting happiness, and there's a very distinct problem with this. And I've mentioned this was the first point: desires are unlimited, status is, it's very finite. Especially that's a good point about globalization as well, is because whenever you had less globalization, you had kind of like smaller centers of sociality. And because things are winner take all, it kind of broke up, the competitions into little like regional and township, national competitions. Now you have a global competition, right? It's like, at least within kind of civilizational centers, there's very few local music stars anymore, right? And there's even less national music stars, right? It's becoming more sports the same way, right? Think about 50 years ago, the local sports star versus today, it's all Messi, Ronaldo, whoever. I don't know. I don't watch soccer. I think that's a big cope too. You should play that shit, not watch it. So the other big problem is that happiness is itself a fleeting feeling, right? You can only feel happy in relationship to other feelings, right? You can't feel happy all the time, because happiness is itself a biochemical response in your brain, right? That'd be really weird, just to expect that you can. And you can do things to make yourself more satisfied, right? You can develop a better life. Like, if you're sleeping 4 hours a night and not exercising, eating like shit, playing video games all the time, you're not going to be as happy compared to having some better habits, generally speaking. And even if you are, that's a situation where civilization has been set up to allow yourself to fall. So we need to understand that happiness is a fleeting feeling, but there are kind of higher purposes that people can have, that societies can be based on. Not necessarily this leftist kind of, oh, we just need happiness. I just want to promote human happiness, which is a great, like, it's naive, but it's like, I've always kind of likened it to, if you took a group of peasants picking coffee or picking tea somewhere in Southeast Asia, compared to university students in the West, guess who's a lot happier in that situation? Here in fucking TU, it's the fucking tea pickers, right? They have very little expectations. They're not fucking connected to social media all the time. They're not spending their time like staring at their dicks and fucking pondering philosophical questions, right? It's a very different sort of vibe. But happiness is one thing, meaning and accomplishment are other things, and that's what you can set societies up to promote. So meaning, there's a really good book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I guarantee you, like, if you think I'm a right-wing Nazi, Nazis fucking hate that book. So there's that. But meaning, having a sense of purpose, right? And I think leftists are very driven by meaning, quite honestly. Like, if it's a very central to their identity sort of thing for leftism. And because they feel like they need to change the world, it becomes a very central aspect to their identity and the meaning they derive from life. So meaning is very important. Like, you should definitely consider that when organizing a technocratic society, ensuring people have meaning. It's a good thing. And the other one is accomplishment, right? You have to find ways for people to succeed in various fields, right? Not everybody's a chess player, not everybody's a kickboxer, not everybody's a writer, but you need to have ways for people to feel accomplishment within their lives, simply to promote a higher form of society. And you can't do this too much, right? Because if you praise people too much, they become like really entitled and shit like that. But you need to find ways for people to actually build skills to accomplish things. And that's a kind of alternative to the sort of broad leftist, we just need happiness. And as I mentioned before, austerity, it's not all bad. Challenge is generally good. You need a kind of anti-fragile civilization. And all of these things can lead to sort of actual wellness, right? Rather than pondering your own mental illnesses or what leftists call mental health, right? Keep in mind that social workers have the lowest IQ of any college field. So all this leads to a natural conclusion, and that is communism is something of a Cope fantasy, right? It's a bunch of hypothetical best case scenarios stacked on top of one another. It's a utopia which doesn't even follow from historical materialism, right? We've seen what's happened, right? It'd be retarded to be like, we just have to fall back on Marx or Lenin, right? Lenin, wrote imperialism 20 years after Engels died. To think that the world hasn't moved on a bit from that would be, I guess dogmatic would be the word used within the left. So we need to have an alternative, right? We can't just throw our hands in the air and critique things and not provide a solution. And I think the alternative is, instead of thinking of in terms of the best possible world, thinking of the least worst plausible system within the confines of historical materialism. What is the least worst sort of outcome? And I think that would be a society which is, in its very essence, if you were to strip away everything else, it would be somewhat anti-fragile to avoid catastrophe, right? And I think there's a lot that goes into that long term, and one of those is being spacefaring, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I think this is an important point that I just want to dwell on for a moment, is that you can't always base things on the best case scenario. Instead, you want to look for what are the problems, and then how do you amend to those, right? If you can't do things ideally, how can you do them not even the best possible way, but given the problems, the technicalities, the real world quote unquote political implications, then what is the least worst possible system? What could you plausibly have that wouldn't be too terrible, but still radically different than from what we have today? And like I said, within the confines of historical materialism, I think we are bound within a certain level of political economy, right? We need these sort of technocratic states, and what do they serve? And I've talked about that before. I've written kind of articles like Declaration of the Post Right, and what was the other one? The Alt Left Manifesto, and I think I wrote another one, a kind of 4chan, not a 4chan, a leftychan.net post on esoteric Jim Bro socialism. You should definitely read that one. It's a brilliant tome on an image board. But I think we can have these sort of utopic visions. And I think we've already seen these. I think we've seen them in the media a little bit. And, this is just an analogy, but I'm going to kick it around. I think the least worst plausible society you could have is Star Trek. Star Trek: The Next Generation. I've never seen the other ones. I imagine they suck. But Star Trek: The Next Generation, it was cool. It was kind of based. It was out there, kind of provided a lesson, I guess. It wasn't as paused as today's stuff. It was very Reading Rainbow-esque. But I think we could have that sort of society where it's spacefaring. There is a hierarchy, right? There's no egalitarianism to say, there's no hard egalitarianism in Star Trek, right? There's the level of the leadership of the ship. There's people who do the work that you don't fucking see. Everybody has their little role, and they get along, right? They're going where no man's gone before, and I think that's an important point. And I want to describe this as sort of socialism with Western characteristics. Is that you need a socialism that's still expansive, right? Though the West has always expanded. The East, they stay put in their little rice valleys. They like that shit. The West, they'll send the little tourists out 20 at a time. But the West is always colonized, and we need that. And we need a socialism that's going places, right? And that's part of being anti-fragile as well. Is you can't have one planet if you're going to succeed over the long term. That's just simply how it is. And even one star, right? You want to branch out. And how can you do that in the best possible way while retaining your humanity? That's another big one, right? Because in Star Trek: The Next Generation, there was the inverse of this. There was the Bugman, the gray socialism of the Bugman, the egalitarianism, the cope about we're all the same, from each according to their ability you will assimilate. And this was the Borg, right? They had the Borg in Star Trek: The Next Generation as this kind of inverse of, the Federation. Federation-based Borg woke bullshit. Think about it like that. But that's Star Trek communism, right? That's the highest form. That's the best you get. It's Star Trek communism, right? But you have to start lower than that, right? We're not complete utopics here. You need a lower form that can get us to that. And I want to say that's been seen in the media too. And that is Starship Troopers socialism. Now, this is a sort of socialist stepping stone to Star Trek communism. And I think this is important too, because you have this society that's somewhat moved on from, laissez-faire capitalism, like, this kind of hedge fund, these gay hedge fund fag rich people, and this sort of stuff. And even the tech fags, right? There's not a whole lot of tech. There's one, and I think he's like the enemy of the movie. But based movie, right? Like, so you have this society. It's kind of moved on from liberal democracy, and they're in a sort of civic socialism, a civic sort of lower form of communism. That's society based on one's contribution to it. You had to be a warrior to be a citizen, and you were still like on a mission, right? You were conquering space, and not only that, you had a worthy challenge, right? There were these other bugmen, there were the insectoid, carnivorous, spacefaring insects, and they were after humanity, right? And humanity had to fight, and they had to set up these corporatist, hardline, socialistic societies again, which involved one's status in society being tied to perpetuating and expanding society, expanding the social system, but in a positive way. not towards the direction of the Borg, not the the tech fag transhumanist, let's all get a microchip and be the same sort of way. No, this is more based, corporatist, hardline, we are the people sort of socialism. And this is the only way to get to Star Trek communism. We need a united people, but we also need to, create people who are united in mind, body, and spirit. And this goes to the alternative, right? We need a sort of socialism that cultivates a higher sort of people, right? If you think about it this way, if you want people to control society, right? If you want people to control the levers of society, you want to have highly capable people, right? Right now we have, what do we have? What are the people today? What are the masses of people like today? They're pretty, out there in their ability to discern basic things in life. So you need a society that is technocratic, but it serves not to create kind of more beaten down, willing slaves, but to create a kind of highly disciplined, highly capable society. And that's what I want to leave you with. So that is the critique of utopic leftist communism, the liberal leftist communism. And, I think it is foundational, right? Like, that's kind of what Marx was about. That's what, Lenin said he was about. But reality hits you in the face, right? And you gotta move on from it. You gotta figure after so many attempts, okay, we've tried this a few times. It always ends up in a liberalized economy with a uniparty state. Maybe that's not so bad. Maybe we can make it better. Certainly what we've had in the West isn't, as it's not the democracy, right? It's not a egalitarian society itself. But maybe we can do something better without the utopia. So this has been Nick Vital for Will to Power podcast. If you enjoyed this, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button, and I will catch you next time.